Welcome to Sleepy Centuries, where the past drifts softly into dreams. Tonight, we'll be exploring the rise and fall of one of the most legendary cities in history, Constantinople, a city of empires, intrigue, golden domes, and whispered prayers in candlelit halls. Before we begin, take a deep breath, settle into your pillow, and close your eyes if you haven't already. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Whether it's a quiet apartment in Tokyo, a farmhouse in the French countryside, or a city balcony in Sao Paulo, history welcomes you. Let's begin. They say all empires begin with a whisper faint, almost forgotten, carried on the wind like a secret only the land remembers. And so it was with Constantinople, long before the name had ever been spoken. Long before its golden domes pierced the sky or its walls repelled invaders. There was only a quiet stretch of land surrounded by the sea where Europe and Asia reached toward each other, like two hands almost touching. A tongue of earth nestled between the Sea of Marmara and the deep waters of the Bosphorus. It was here, on this almost mythic coastline, that a modest Greek settlement once stood, founded by colonists from the city of Megara. They called it Byzantium. There was nothing particularly grand about Byzantium at first. It was a small town in the vast theatre of the ancient world, a mere dot on the map compared to the roaring capitals of Athens or Rome. But it had something rare, something no map could ever fully capture. It had geography, it had position, and in the game of empires, position is everything. The land jutted out into the water like a natural watchtower, controlling the passage between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Trade flowed past its shores, armies dreamed of holding it, and merchants prayed their ships would find its harbours. Though modest, Byzantium was quietly powerful, quietly essential. And the empires of the world, even if they didn't know it yet, would someday revolve around this sleeping city. Centuries passed, and the town remained, patient and unassuming. The Greeks came and went, the Persians swept through and vanished. The Romans claimed it as their own, folding it into their vast, complex dominion. But the true transformation came not from conquest, but from vision, from one man, one emperor, Constantine. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was no longer the invincible colossus it once was. Its western half groaned under pressure, fractured, fraying, stretched thin by invasions and internal decay. But the East still held promise, its cities glittering with life, wealth, and culture. Constantine, whose star had risen through the ranks of Rome's brutal power struggles, saw in the East something more than stability. He saw destiny. He understood that the empire needed a new heartone that beat not from the ruins of Rome, but from a fresh beginning, a place that could carry the legacy forward without being shackled to the crumbling past. And so, he turned his gaze to Byzantium. He walked its shores, surveyed its hills, felt the wind that crossed the seas. He must have sensed the ancient stillness of the place, the way the sunlight shimmered on the water, the way the land seemed to rise like a throne. Here, he decided, the empire would begin again. In 324 AD, he claimed it. In 330, he consecrated it. The new Rome, Nova Roma. But names have a way of following men more than cities, and so it became known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. From the beginning, it was designed not as a colony or outpost, but as an imperial vision carved into the earth. Temples, forums, aqueducts, and palaces sprang up as if summoned by will alone. Roman architecture met Eastern mysticism. Pagan shrines stood beside Christian churches. The roads, straight and commanding, led not just to other cities, but to the idea of Rome reborn. Constantine infused the city with symbols of eternity, relics brought from distant lands, columns taken from ancient temples, and monuments built to defy time itself. He even erected a towering column in the city's center, topped with a statue of himself dressed as Apollo, gazing toward the heavens, as if to say, "This is the center. Now, this is where the sun rises." But Constantine wasn't just building in stone. He was shaping identity. With Constantinople, the empire no longer looked westward, but eastward, toward the light of a new future, toward the wealth of Asia, toward the rising tides of change. He poured into the city, not just treasure, but belief. It would be Christian, yet Roman. Eastern in geography, but imperial in soul. A bridge between worlds, forged in vision, guarded by sea and spirit alike. And as night fell over the marble streets and flickering oil lamps lit the alleys, Constantinople exhaled its first breath, not as a place borrowed from another age, but as something new, something destined. A city where emperors would be crowned, where civilizations would rise and fall, and where history would leave deep footprints in stone. The world had not yet grasped what had been born on that narrow stretch of land. But time would, and the whisper that began in Byzantium would soon roar across centuries. Imagine a city so precious, so desired, that it would need to shield itself from the dreams of every would-be conqueror who ever gazed upon its walls. A city standing at the seam of two continents, blessed by nature, chosen by emperors, and coveted by kings. From the moment Constantine laid its first stones, Constantinople was never just a city, it was a promise. But promises need protection. And while the sea guarded its flanks with deep, merciless waters, its landward side remained vulnerable, exposed to the ambitions of men and empires. It was here, along the western edge of the city, that one of the greatest fortifications in human history would rise, a wall, not just of stone and mortar, but of intention, power, and enduring defiance. When Emperor Theodosius II ascended the throne in the early 5th century, he was only a child, a boy emperor in a world that demanded strength. But behind him stood wise and able men, advisors and generals who knew the dangers that loomed beyond the empire's borders. The Roman Empire was no longer at its peak. Waves of migration, war, and upheaval moved across Europe like storm clouds, and every fortress, every road, every grain of wheat had to be defended with care. In this atmosphere of tension and transformation, a decision was made. Constantinople would not merely be defended, it would be encased, armored like a giant ready for siege. What followed was an engineering marvel so grand that it would stand, unbroken, for over 1,000 years. The Theodosian walls, as they would later be known, were not simple barriers. They were a system, layers upon layers of defense that rose like a mountain range from the soil. A deep, wide moat came first, often filled with water, its banks steep and unforgiving. Then a low outer wall, lined with towers, designed to slow the enemy and draw them into range. Behind that, a higher inner wall, massive, thick, unyielding, punctuated with strong towers every 50 to 70 meters, each one a silent sentinel watching the horizon. And finally, a third inner wall, the strongest of them all, rising high and crowned with battlements. Together, this triad of defense wrapped the land side of Constantinople in an unbreakable embrace. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Over 6 kilometers long, these walls became more than fortification. They became myth. Stories would circulate through the centuries of how arrows shattered against them, how fire died upon their stones, how even the fiercest armies crashed like waves, only to be broken and turned back. Siege engines splintered against their bulk, tunnels were dug and collapsed, ladders reached up and were flung down. Again and again, the enemies came, believing they could take the city, only to be humbled by the cold, silent defiance of those walls. But stone alone cannot hold a city. It was the people who lived within stonecutters, masons, soldiers, and citizens who maintained and repaired the defenses, sometimes in frantic haste as threats closed in. After earthquakes struck, the citizens rushed to rebuild. In one such event, in the year 447, an earthquake caused major damage to the wall. With Attila the Hun approaching from the Danube, the city faced an unthinkable threat. Yet, in just 60 days, the citizens and soldiers repaired the damaged sections under the command of a single dedicated official named Constantine, son of Acacius. They worked day and night, with hands bleeding and eyes stinging from dust, knowing that the survival of the empire depended not on the emperor's word, but on their labor. And when Attila came, he found the walls restored, imposing, immovable, and entirely prepared for war. Inside the walls, life pulsed with rhythm and confidence. Markets bustled, children played in courtyards, monks prayed behind cloistered doors. The city trusted its walls like a child trusts the arms of a parent, and rightly so, for generation after generation, they did not fall. While Rome itself had been sacked, burned, and humiliated by the Visigoths, Constantinople stood tall. It became a city of refuge and resilience, an unbroken fortress watching the tides of history roll past. The walls became a symbol, a kind of promise between the city and its people. So long as they stood, so did the empire, and every stone whispered that promise, even in the silence of night. They were not perfect, they could be damaged, cracked, challenged, but each time they rose again, as if the city's will was set in limestone and marble. Foreign envoys would approach from afar and marvel at the scale. Traders arriving by caravan would pause, awestruck, as the towers loomed above them. Pilgrims and poets wrote of their grandeur, of the way they seemed to stretch into the sky, indifferent to time or decay. But perhaps the most haunting power of the Theodosian walls was not their strength, but their patience. They watched as emperors came and went, as plagues swept through the streets, as golden mosaics were placed and later stolen. They saw triumphs and tragedies, betrayals and blessings. And yet, they remained, keeping their silent vigil over a city that dared to dream it could last forever. Even when the world changed, when new religions, languages, and cultures swept over the land, those walls stayed firm, unyielding, waiting, remembering. And so, when night fell over Constantinople, when the flicker of torches danced along the towers and the sea breeze whispered through the arrow slits, the city would rest in the quiet confidence of its strength. It would dream, even as the world outside stirred with envy, for it was not just a city of emperors, it was a city wrapped in stone, guarded by vision, and trusted by history itself. The story of Constantinople would never be complete without the man whose ambition nearly eclipsed the city itself, Justinian. In the vast chronicle of emperors, generals, and kings, few names resonate with the sheer scale of vision and the stubborn will to reshape the world as his. Born a peasant in a backwater province of the empire, Justinian was not meant to rule, yet fate, and perhaps something more, drew him upward. Educated, brilliant, and relentlessly driven, he rose to the purple not through blood, but through brilliance. And when he finally sat upon the imperial throne in the year 527, he did not look upon Constantinople as a finished city, but as raw marble, waiting for the hand of a sculptor. To understand the reign of Justinian is to understand contradiction. His rule was filled with both ruin and resurrection, chaos and glory. He was a man who dreamed of Romanov, the fading empire that remained, but the ideal that had once stretched from the sands of Africa to the hills of Britannia. And for a brief, shimmering moment in the 6th century, he almost brought that dream to life. His generals, most famously the great Belisarius, waged war on distant shores, reclaiming territories in North Africa, Italy, and Spain. Rome itself, fallen to the Goths, was retaken. The empire, fractured and diminished, seemed once again to expand its wings. But while armies marched and cities burned, Justinian's heart remained firmly in Constantinople. At the very center of his vision for the city stood a structure unlike any the world had seen, a cathedral so vast, so sublime, that it would become the very soul of Constantinople. Hagia Sophia, the church of holy wisdom. But before it could rise, the city would burn. In the year 532, during the early years of Justinian's reign, Constantinople was gripped by chaos. Discontent with heavy taxation and imperial policies boiled over during what began as a chariot racing dispute between rival factions known as the Blues and the Greens. But what started in the Hippodrome quickly spilled into the streets, and then into a full-scale revolt. The Nika riots, as they came to be known, were unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. Fires raged through entire districts. Palaces, churches, and homes were reduced to ash. The flames danced through the skyline, consuming the old heart of the capital. For 5 terrifying days, it seemed the empire itself might collapse. Justinian, overwhelmed, considered fleeing. But his wife, the Empress Theodora, an iron-willed former actress who matched her husband in ambition and resolve, refused. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she said, and with those words, she anchored her husband to his throne. The rebellion was crushed in a river of blood. Tens of thousands were killed in the Hippodrome, as imperial forces retook the city by force. And from the ashes, Justinian began again, not with hesitation, but with an almost divine urgency. He ordered that the ruins of the previous church on the site be cleared. In its place, Hagia Sophia would rise not just as a place of worship, but as a symbol of power, order, and transcendence. He summoned the finest minds of the empire, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, a mathematician and a physicist, not traditional architects, but men who thought in terms of geometry, light, and space. Construction began almost immediately and proceeded at a pace that seemed to defy time itself. In less than 6 years, the great cathedral was completed. And when Justinian entered the completed structure for the first time, he stood beneath the massive central dome, floating, it seemed, on nothing at all, as if suspended by heaven, and uttered words that echoed through history. "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." The Hagia Sophia was not merely a building, it was an act of faith. Its dome, over 30 meters wide, rested on pendentive San innovation that allowed a round dome to sit atop a square base, blending the solid with the celestial. Light poured through windows at its base, giving the impression that the dome hovered on a cushion of air. Gold mosaics shimmered in the candlelight. Marble imported from the farthest reaches of the empire lined the walls and columns, veined in blues, reds, greens, and whites, each piece chosen for its elegance. The church became a world unto itself, a place where theology met architecture, where light was shaped like sculpture, and where every step felt like entering a different realm. But Justinian's legacy extended far beyond architecture. He sought not only to restore the empire's geography, but its spirit. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, vast codification of Roman laws that would go on to influence legal systems across Europe for centuries. In halls and courts across the world, echoes of Justinian's legal reforms can still be felt today. It was his way of bringing order not just to bricks and mortar, but to the invisible structure of society itself. Yet for all his achievements, Justinian's reign was not one of peace. While he built monuments of dazzling beauty, his people often suffered. His wars drained the treasury. His taxes were heavy. The plague of 541, which would come to be known as the Plague of Justinian, swept through the empire, like death riding on the wind, killing millions and leaving cities hollow and trembling. Constantinople was not spared. The streets grew quiet, the docks emptied. The great cathedral itself became a place not of celebration but of mourning, filled with the echo of prayers for the dying. Still, Justinian endured. Like the city he ruled, he seemed carved from something immovable. He reigned for nearly 40 years, and when he finally died in 565, he left behind a city transformed. Under his hand, Constantinople had become more than a capitalate, had become a beacon, a place where ambition and divinity, war and wisdom, beauty and brutality all existed side by side. And while the empire would continue to shift and struggle in the centuries ahead, the imprint of Justinian would never fade. Long after his death, travelers would journey across continents just to catch sight of Hagia Sophia's dome glinting in the morning sun. Pilgrims would kneel on its marble floors, emperors would pray beneath its arches. And even in ruin, even in conquest, Justinian's voice would still seem to whisper through its halls proud, defiant, eternal. In that whisper lived the dream of a man who rebuilt a city from ashes, who dared to grasp eternity, and who, for one brief moment, made the old empire feel new again. In the hushed, candlelit halls of Constantinople's countless chapels and basilicas, where gold mosaics shimmered like sunlight on water and incense curled through marble columns, a storm was brewing. But it wasn't a storm of swords or invading armies, it was a storm of belief, a quiet fire of the soul that would rage through centuries. The Byzantines, more than any other people of their time, wove their faith into every layer of life. God was not a distant figure, nor merely a presence in the church. He was in the streets, the weather, the walls, and the icons that stared back with serene, eternal eyes. And in a city where emperors believed they ruled by divine right, the boundary between the sacred and the political was often impossible to draw. That tension, that blurring of lines between the throne and the altar, would explode into one of the most haunting chapters of the empire's long twilight iconoclasm. The heart of it was simple, yet carried centuries of weight. Could images of the diviniacons of Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints truly be holy, or were they idols, condemned by the very scriptures the empire claimed to uphold? For centuries, the Byzantine faithful had kissed these icons, wept before them, prayed to them in times of fear and joy. These images weren't just art, they were windows into the divine, but others saw danger. They believed these sacred images had crossed a line, that people had begun to worship the paint and wood itself, rather than the divine being it represented. And in a society where heresy was as feared as plague, doubt could turn to fire in an instant. In the 8th century, Emperor Leo III, a hardened military man shaped by war and loss, took a bold and fateful step. In 726, he issued an edict forbidding the veneration of icons. It wasn't merely a religious move, it was political, strategic. The empire had suffered earthquakes, famines, and military defeats, and some saw these as divine punishments for idolatry. Leo believed that purging the empire of images would bring back God's favor, but Constantinople was not a city to be easily stripped of its soul. Resistance flared. Monks, scholars, and common citizens alike clung to their icons with a fierce devotion that no decree could extinguish. Monasteries became fortresses of protest, their walls hiding not soldiers, but images of saints wrapped in linen, guarded like relics of another age. And so began the age of iconoclasm, an era of tearing down and building up, of breaking what had been sacred and challenging what had been assumed eternal. Churches were stripped bare, frescoes were scraped from the walls, mosaics plastered over, and sacred images burned in public squares. Those who resisted, particularly monks and theologians, were exiled, imprisoned, or worse. The empire, already stretched thin by wars and internal strain, now waged a war upon itself, upon its very soul. And in the middle of it all stood the people of Constantinople, bewildered, torn between emperor and tradition, caught in a battle that couldn't be won by swords. But iconoclasm wasn't simply destruction. It forced the empire to ask dangerous, essential questions. What is faith made of? What do we see when we gaze upon the face of a saint? Is holiness something we can touch, or is it forever beyond our grasp? Some emperors pressed forward. Leo's son, Constantine V, continued the iconoclast policy with ruthless efficiency. He saw the monastic communities as nests of superstition and resistance. His campaigns against them were brutal, calculated not only to crush rebellion, but to reshape the very nature of Byzantine Christianity. And for a time, it seemed the icons might vanish forever, remembered only in secret and in stories whispered between the faithful. But ideas, once rooted deep in the hearts of a people, do not die easily. In the year 787, under Empress Irenaeon, of the most remarkable women to ever wear the imperial crown, the tide turned. A council was held in Nicaea, and the veneration of icons was restored, not as idolatry, but as a reflection of incarnation, the belief that Christ had taken human form and could therefore be depicted. It was not just a theological victory, it was a return of beauty to a city that had felt, for decades, like it had been holding its breath. The mosaics were uncovered. Icons returned to churches like long-lost friends. Gold once more glinted beneath flickering candlelight. The city sighed in relief. But the peace was not to last. A second wave of iconoclasm would rise again in the 9th century, though weaker, less driven by fire and fury than before. The empire was changing, growing tired, leaning ever more heavily on tradition. And eventually, in 843, the final restoration of the icons was declared, celebrated with solemn procession, through the streets of Constantinople, a city weary of its own internal wars, longing to remember what it had once been. That day would be remembered as the triumph of orthodoxy, a feast still honored in Eastern Christian traditions to this day. Through it all, the icons endured. The faces of saints, once hidden, looked out again from domes and walls, their expressions calm, forgiving, eternal. They had survived not only fire and fury, but doubt, and in that survival, Constantinople found something precious, a return to itself. Not a victory of one faction over another, but a slow, painful reconciliation between faith and image, between the seen and the unseen. And so the city, scarred but standing, moved forward. Its domes still reached toward heaven, its bells still rang through the dusk. And in quiet chapels, lit by a single flickering lamp, the faithful once again stood before their icons, whispering prayers not to paint or wood, but through them towards something far beyond. For in Constantinople, nothing was ever just what it seemed, and every image held a story, every silence a memory. The world beyond Constantinople was in flux. Kingdoms rose and fell like tides. Barbarian hordes surged across distant frontiers. Old orders crumbled, and entire languages disappeared into the silence of time. In the west, the city of Romith, eternal city, had fallen to ruin. Streets once echoing with triumphal processions now lay overgrown and empty. Marble statues, broken and unwept for, lay face down in the dust. The Western Roman Empire, once a beacon of law and order, had fractured into a patchwork of warring tribes and crumbling legacies. But far to the east, Constantinople remained a light on the horizon, unextinguished. It stood not only as a city, but as a living memory of the empire that had once ruled the known world. And in the gathering shadows of the early medieval centuries, that light only burned brighter. Here, where Europe and Asia kissed across the Bosphorus, Constantinople became something greater than a capital. It became a crossroads, a place where languages blended, where traditions overlapped, where East met West, not in war, but in wonder. In the marketplaces of the city, silks from China flowed in, alongside spices from India, furs from the north, ivory from Africa, and gold from the far corners of the earth. Traders spoke in Greek, Arabic, Latin, Armenian, Persian, and tongues already long forgotten. In narrow alleys where hanging lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, you could smell cinnamon and myrrh, roasted almonds, and sea salt carried in by ships docking at the Golden Horn. No city on earth matched its elegance, nor its complexity. Constantinople was a city of contradictions, where ancient Roman law was debated in cloistered schools by men in Eastern robes, where devout Christian monks copied sacred texts by hand in candlelight, while Muslim ambassadors from distant caliphates dined in glittering halls just beyond, where Greek philosophy survived, not as museum pieces, but as living thought passed between teacher and student. It was a melting pot, a kaleidoscope of humanity, bound together by an imperial dream that still lingered, even as the world changed around it. And while the West had entered what some would call the Dark Ages, Constantinople was still very much awake. It became the vault of civilization, preserving knowledge, art, architecture, and literature that would otherwise have vanished into oblivion. The great libraries of the city stored scrolls, copied from lost Roman texts. Its scholars wrestled with science and theology, astronomy and mathematics. They studied the stars and debated the nature of the divine with equal passion. They argued not over whether the past should be remembered, but how best to interpret it. And their work, their care, would one day reignite the flame of learning across Europe during the Renaissance. But here, in these centuries of quiet resilience, that flame was guarded in Constantinople, like a lamp kept alight in a storm. Even beyond the books and markets, the city pulsed with beauty and ritual. Its churches, especially the Hagia Sophia, remained unmatched in grandeur. Pilgrims came from far-off lands simply to gaze at its dome, to stand in silence beneath its vast and glowing ceiling, and feel as though heaven had descended to earth. The Byzantines called it the second heaven, and indeed, it felt as though you were no longer in the world you knew. Choirs sang in voices that floated like incense, echoing into the depths of space and soul alike. Every tile, every mosaic, every flicker of gold light seemed woven into a single act of devotion, a city, offering itself to God through beauty. And yet, Constantinople was never only holy, it was human. Its streets were filled with laughter and argument, with beggars and poets, merchants and magistrates. 1,000 accents filled the air. Its harbor bustled with ships unloading exotic cargoes. Its taverns told stories of travelers who'd crossed deserts and oceans to reach its gates. Children played beneath aqueducts built generations before their birth, while old men sat on stone benches, telling tales of emperors long gone. The city was alive, every inch of it thick with memory. But even as Constantinople flourished, the world around it was changing. A new force had emerged from the deserts of Arabia. The Islamic caliphates, driven by fervent belief and dynamic leadership, had exploded across the map with astonishing speed. Within a century, they had conquered the Sassanid Empire, claimed much of the old Roman East, and come to dominate trade routes once watched over by Byzantine garrisons. Arabic became the language of science and philosophy. Cities like Baghdad and Cordoba blossomed with knowledge and beauty. And yet, amidst this rising Islamic golden age, Constantinople remained the immovable city at the edge of their reach. They came for it many times. Arab fleets blockaded the sea, armies encircled its land walls, and yet each time, Constantinople held. In part, this was due to its military brilliance, flaming Greek fire hurled from ships, impregnable walls that defied siege, cunning diplomacy that pitted rivals against one another. But more than anything, the city survived because it believed it must. The Byzantines saw themselves not merely as survivors, but as guardians of civilization. They were the inheritors of Rome, the chosen of God, the last true empire in a world gone mad. And so they endured, not out of arrogance, but out of duty to the past, to the faith, and to the fragile thread of memory that they alone seemed to protect. In these centuries, Constantinople stood as a lighthouse, shining even when surrounded by storm. It was not immune to struggle plague, fire, corruption, and poverty gnawed at its edges, but it remained. It remembered when others forgot. It preserved when others abandoned, and it did so not just with walls of stone, but with quiet determination, with scholars who kept writing, singers who kept chanting, and children who kept learning the names of emperors who had died 1,000 years before. So when you think of the so-called Middle Ages, when you picture a world wrapped in darkness and silence, remember that far to the east, there was a city still glowing, its streets humming with life, its churches filled with music, its markets overflowing with silk and spices, a city where the flame of knowledge, dim but not extinguished, continued to flicker through the long night. That city was Constantinople, and as the world outside changed, it watched, waited, and endured. Constantinople had survived more than most cities could ever imagine. Fires, riots, earthquakes, plagues, and endless changes of power had left their marks, yet still it stood, dignified and shining. It had outlived its Western counterpart, watched kingdoms fall and rise, watched languages vanish and faiths evolve. And all the while, it remained a city wrapped in stone, crowned with domes, and guarded by sea and sky. But the fate of such a city, envied and admired in equal measure, was to live under the constant shadow of threat. The stronger it stood, the more the world wanted to test its strength. Siege after siege would hammer at its gates, some remembered, some forgotten, but all leaving echoes in its walls and stories in the streets. To be Constantinople was to be watched, yearned for, and challenged again and again. From the east came the Arab armies, fierce and swift, inspired by the rise of Islam and determined to bring their new empire to the gates of Byzantium's capital. In the 7th and 8th centuries, they came in waves, by land and by sea. They laid siege to the city with tremendous force, bringing ships to the Bosphorus and armies to the land walls. For years, the siege would drag on, and at times, it seemed like the walls might finally crack under the weight of history. But Constantinople had one more secret Greek fire, a weapon of flame hurled from siphons on Byzantine ships. It burned even on water and terrified those who faced it. The Arab fleets, so powerful elsewhere, found themselves consumed in an inferno they couldn't fight. The walls held, the fire roared, and the attackers, stunned by the city's unyielding grip on survival, eventually turned back. For a time, the world marveled once more. Constantinople, again, had endured what should have been the end. Then came the Bulgars from the north, a rising power watching the empire's northern borders with interest. They too tested the city's strength, sending armies down from the Danube to probe its defenses. Battles were fought in the countryside, treaties were signed and broken, but the walls, always the walls stood, as they had for centuries. The city was not easy to starve or surprise. Its storehouses were vast, its cisterns deep, and its citizens used to the long rhythms of siege. Children grew up knowing the thud of battering rams and the whistle of arrows, yet they played in the shadow of towers that had never been breached. Merchants still traded, bells still rang. Life, somehow, carried on inside the skin of the city. Even so, Constantinople was not invincible. The empire behind its walls was not what it once had been. Lands had been lost, economies had weakened. Emperors no longer ruled over a unified Mediterranean, but over a shrinking crescent of influence. And beyond its borders, new powers were rising. The Rus, from the north, came down the rivers in longboats, fierce warriors from the forests and fjords of distant lands. In 860, they appeared with little warning and attacked the city by sea. This time, the defenses were caught off guard. Churches were looted, fires spread, panic rippled through the population. But even then, the city's spirit didn't break. Prayers filled the Hagia Sophia, citizens gathered behind the walls, and somehow, as before, the tide turned. The Rus retreated, and once again the city stitched its wounds and resumed its ancient rhythm. But each siege left more than scars. It chipped away at the illusion of invulnerability. It reminded the people inside that even the most perfect of walls could not keep the world out forever. There was a quiet tension that hung in the air, even in times of peace. Emperors came and went with growing speed, their reigns often measured in years, not decades. Some were wise and just. Others were cruel or foolish. Some rose from noble blood. Others were soldiers, chosen not for lineage, but for their ability to command loyalty and wield power. The imperial throne, once a sacred inheritance, had become a dangerous prize. The people of Constantinople watched it, all revolts in the provinces, betrayal in the court, battles on the frontiers. But they kept living, as they always had. They filled the markets each morning. They watched ships pull into the harbor, bringing goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. They lit candles in churches, whispered prayers before icons, and taught their children to read in a language passed down through centuries. They walked the same streets that emperors had walked, prayed beneath the same domes, touched the same worn stones of ancient gates, and all the while, they waited, not in fear, but in knowledge. The city had been tested before, and would be tested again. It was a truth etched into every brick. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the empire seemed to breathe again. Strong rulers reclaimed lost lands, the military was reformed, the treasury swelled, culture blossomed, art and architecture thrived. Constantinople stood not only as the bastion of the East, but as a jewel of learning and culture. Pilgrims and diplomats traveled from as far as England and France just to marvel at its grandeur. Stories of its streets, its riches, its domes and churches filled the courts of distant lands. To outsiders, it seemed eternal, but beneath that shine, the same pressures were building. Enemies were watching. The Seljuk Turks were rising in the east. The Normans moved through the west. Even within, tensions simmered between generals and emperors, between Orthodox and Catholic, between the past and the uncertain future. The memory of siege was never far from the minds of the Byzantines. They lived with the knowledge that peace could never be taken for granted. Every festival, every coronation, every feast was held with one eye turned toward the horizon. And though the city endured, though its walls still reached proudly into the sky, and its towers caught the wind from both continents, the world was no longer so distant. Constantinople was a city besieged not only by armies, but by time itself. And as the sun set each evening behind the domes, and the cries of seagulls faded into the dusk, the people walked home beneath stars that had looked down upon countless invasions, countless prayers, and countless dreams. The city was still standing, but the winds were shifting, and soon those winds would carry a storm unlike any before. The year was 1204, and the winds that once carried pilgrims and merchants to Constantinople now carried something far more dangerous, sails filled, not with trade but with betrayal. It was a spring unlike any other. The city had seen war, siege, and fire, but what was coming would not look like an enemy in the traditional sense. There would be no barbarian horde thundering across the plains, no Eastern empire bearing down with foreign tongues and unfamiliar gods. This time, the danger came wrapped in the symbols of friendship, in the banners of Christendom, in the colors of those who claimed to be brothers. It came in the form of the Fourth Crusade. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, you have to first understand the desperation that had crept into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The golden centuries were long behind them. The emperors no longer ruled over vast lands. Their armies had thinned, their treasury had dwindled, and their politics had become tangled in webs of intrigue, betrayal, and backroom bargains. In the decades leading up to the Fourth Crusade, the imperial court had become a revolving door of power grabs, blinding rival claimants, imprisoning emperors, and relying more and more on foreign mercenaries to keep the peace. The people still lit candles in Hagia Sophia, still whispered prayers beneath its glowing dome, but outside, the world had begun to close in. The Fourth Crusade had been intended to recapture Jerusalem, a holy endeavor wrapped in zeal and promises, but it never reached the Holy Land. Through a chaotic tangle of politics, debt, and opportunism, the Crusaders found themselves camped not in the deserts of Palestine, but on the doorstep of Constantinople. The Republic of Venice, who had financed the Crusaders' journey in return for promises of conquest and trade, saw a different prize, not salvation, but wealth. And Constantinople, glimmering still, a city of marble, relics, gold, and legend, was vulnerable. Inside the city, factions warred with words and knives in shadowed halls. The throne had changed hands with dizzying speed. Promises were made and broken. One exiled prince, Alexios IV, son of a deposed emperor, offered the Crusaders everything they asked for: money, soldiers, allegiance if they would help him reclaim the throne. The Crusaders agreed, more out of greed than faith, and in 1203, they approached the city not as invaders, but as so-called liberators. But nothing in Constantinople came easy. When Alexios was installed, the gold he promised didn't exist. The people resented him, the court distrusted him, and the Crusaders grew impatient. Soon, frustration turned to violence. Negotiations crumbled, tensions boiled, and then, in April of 1204, the unthinkable happened. The Crusaders launched a full assault on the city, the most fortified, most defended, most admired city in Christendom. And this time, the walls, battered from within by weakness and division, finally broke. What followed was not a battle, it was not a siege, it was a pillaging, a desecration, a nightmare come to life. For 3 days, Constantinople was consumed by horror. Crusaders tore through the streets, setting fire to entire districts. Palaces were looted, churches were violated. The great libraries, filled with ancient texts from Rome and Greece, were ransacked and destroyed. The Hagia Sophia, the very heart of the Orthodox world, was stormed not by pagans or heretics, but by fellow Christians. They smashed icons, trampled relics, stole gold and jewels meant for God. They melted down altarpieces, pried mosaics from walls, and rode their horses through the sacred nave. Women were dragged from their homes, monks and nuns were attacked. Even the tombs of emperors were split open, their bones scattered in the streets. The wealth that had taken centuries to accumulate vanished in hours, carted away on ships bound for Venice and other ports of the West. Statues, columns, silks, and saints' bones were all plundered. The very soul of Constantinople was stripped bare, and what had once been the shining light of the Christian world now stood as a hollowed ruin. For the Byzantines, this betrayal cut deeper than any sword. It wasn't just a loss of treasure or territory, it was a violation of trust, of faith, of identity. The invaders wore crosses on their tunics and spoke the name of Christ, but they had acted with the cruelty of enemies sworn to destroy. The Eastern and Western churches, already strained by centuries of theological and political tension, now stood on opposite shores of an abyss. The schism, which had begun in quiet disagreements, now became a chasm filled with blood and grief. The city that had once stood as the guardian of Christendom had been violated by those who claimed to serve its cause. And when the fires died down, when the looters had gone and the dust settled, what remained was a ghost. Constantinople, once queen of cities, had been humbled in a way it had never known. For the next half-century, it would be ruled by Latin emperors-foreigners who cared little for the traditions, the faith, or the spirit of Byzantium. The people lived in mourning. They whispered of the past in quiet corners, teaching their children not to forget the names of emperors, the meaning of icons, the sound of the old liturgies. But even in ruin, Constantinople endured. In 1261, after decades of humiliation, the Byzantines reclaimed their city. A general named Alexios Strategopoulos, leading a small force, found the city lightly guarded and took it back with almost no bloodshed. The return was not triumphant, it was sorrowful. The city was broken, impoverished, and depopulated. The great churches still stood, but many were in ruin. The palaces were empty, the forums silent, yet the people returned. They lit candles again, they cleaned the ash from the icons, they sang hymns in damaged chapels. They began, slowly, to rebuild not just walls, but a way of life. But the scars of 1204 never fully healed. The empire that returned was not the empire that had once commanded the Mediterranean. It was smaller, weaker, cautious. The confidence had been shaken, the myth of invincibility shattered, and though emperors would still be crowned, and rituals would continue, it was all done in the shadow of loss. Constantinople had been betrayed, not by enemies from afar, but by those who had once knelt at the same altar, and that memory would linger, like smoke clinging to old stone, long after the fires had gone cold. The centuries following the city's reclamation in 1261 were not filled with triumph, but with quiet endurance. Constantinople had returned to its rightful hands, but the damage was done. The golden veil had been torn. The city that had once held the world's admiration now clung to survival with the brittle grace of an aging monarch. Its palaces were cracked, its streets no longer rang with the voices of a bustling empire, and the population, once in the hundreds of thousands, had dwindled to a fraction of its former glory. The empire that ruled from its throne was no longer a sprawling dominion of provinces and legions. It was now little more than a shell of its former self, hemmed in on every side by rising powers and a future it could no longer shape. Still, the city lived. Even diminished, Constantinople remained a place of haunting beauty. The domes still rose over the skyline like ancient crowns, and the sea still glimmered at its feet. Markets reopened, artisans returned, monasteries once again filled with chants and candles. The people of the city, hardened by a century of humiliation, carried on with a kind of soft defiance. They had lived through fire and betrayal. They had seen their churches desecrated, their emperors exiled, their relics carried away, but they remained, and their city wounded, though it was remained with them. In these twilight years of the empire, emperors were often no longer rulers of vast territories, but caretakers of memory. They were crowned with ceremony, processed through streets that remembered better days, and made decisions that often reached no further than the city walls. Their robes were rich, their words grand, but the empire they presided over was shrinking year by year. What had once stretched from the Italian coasts to the Euphrates had been reduced to pockets of resistance, islands of power amid a rising tide. And all the while, a new force was watching. To the east, the Ottoman Turks were rising with silent inevitability. Once just another Anatolian principality, they had grown strong through clever leadership, military prowess, and a deep understanding of the crumbling world around them. They knew that the Byzantines were no longer the empire of old. They knew the walls of Constantinople still stood, but that the empire behind them was hollow, stretched thin, and increasingly alone. Slowly, methodically, they took Byzantine cities in Anatolia, then in the Balkans. They surrounded Constantinople, not with sudden war, but with the patience of a hunter circling weakened prey. The last emperors of Byzantium watched this unfold with a grim kind of dignity. They negotiated, begged, resisted. They traveled to Western courts in hopes of securing aid from fellow Christians, offering allegiance to the Pope, speaking of unity and shared purpose. But the West was no longer listening. Europe was changing, focusing inward, divided by its own wars and ambitions. Crusades were no longer aimed at the East, and Constantinople's cries for help were answered with silence or vague promises that never came. Alone, the Byzantines turned inward. They debated theology with fierce intensity. They composed hymns, copied manuscripts, and wrote chronicles as if to preserve every remaining thread of who they had been. There was beauty in that melancholy. Artists continued to paint icons with delicate gold halos, even as the city's outer walls crumbled. Monks wrote in candlelight, their ink flowing in ancient Greek, even as the world moved on without them. Mothers told their children stories of emperors and saints, of Justinian and Constantine, of times when the city had ruled the world. Even when hunger stalked the alleys and the treasury lay bare, there was a sense quiet but unshakable that the soul of the empire still lived in these stones, these prayers, these names whispered in the shadows. But no amount of memory could stop what was coming. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople was almost entirely surrounded. The Ottomans had grown into an empire of their own, young, confident, and ambitious. They built fortresses near the city, cutting off trade. They tested the city's defenses, observed its rhythms. And in the hearts of the people, there was a growing sense of finality. They still believed in miracles. They still prayed for deliverance. But the sound of hoofbeats on the horizon was getting louder. Yet even in these last years, there was something unshakably noble about the city. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the final ruler of Byzantium, walked its walls not as a king burdened by defeat, but as a man preparing for legacy. He had no illusions. He knew the odds. But he also knew the history. He stood in the line of emperors, stretching back 1,000 years, a line that had carried the torch of Rome into the East, that had guarded civilization through fire and famine, and he would not abandon that legacy easily. And so, the final decades of Constantinople were filled with a strange, poignant, quiet, not resignation, but a sort of sacred calm, like the final movements of a symphony, slower but more profound. The city was dying, but not with rage or panic. It was fading like a flame that had burned long and bright, leaving behind warmth even as the light dimmed. The people continued to walk the old streets. The bells still rang. The sea still lapped at the marble embankments. The Hagia Sophia still glowed at sunset, its dome catching the last light of day. And in that light, you could still see the reflection of an empire that had once dared to shape the world. They waited, not for victory, but for what would come. And as the winds shifted and the young empire to the east prepared its final move, Constantinople stood, aged and scarred, but still beautiful, still Byzantine, still eternal in its own quiet way. It began with a silence, not the calm of peace, but the tense, breath-held stillness that settles before something irreversible. Constantinople, once the queen of cities, now stood surrounded, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen too much and hoped too long. In the spring of 1453, the city found itself at the center of a storm it had sensed approaching for years, perhaps even for generations. The Ottoman Empire, young, vast, and hungry, had grown from a small frontier state to a mighty power stretching across Anatolia and deep into the Balkans. Its Sultan, Mehmed II, was only 21 years old, yet already seasoned by battle, politics, and ambition. To the world, he was called Mehmed the Conqueror, and he had fixed his eyes on Constantinople with a focus that bordered on destiny. For him, it was more than a city. It was a crown that remained unclaimed, a jewel from another age, waiting to be taken. In early April, the Ottoman army arrived. It was enormous of thousands of soldiers, artillery crews, engineers, cavalry, and support caravans. Estimates vary, but the defenders inside the city numbered perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 at most. They were vastly outnumbered. They were exhausted, underfunded, and isolated. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the final ruler of Byzantium, knew what he was facing. There would be no reinforcements. The West had sent promises, but not armies. Rome had dispatched a few ships, a few knights, but Christendom was too fragmented to rise in defense of what had once been its greatest city. The emperor had written letters, made desperate appeals, and still he found himself standing on the battlements with a loyal but hopelessly small band of soldiers, monks, and citizens. Most were Greek, but many others were Genoese, Venetians, mercenaries, and volunteers drawn not by political alliance, but by something deeper, a respect for the city, for its meaning, a recognition that its fall would mark the end of something ancient. The Ottomans set up their camp across the Golden Horn and the land walls. They brought with them something the city had never faced on such a scale: cannons. At the heart of their artillery was a massive bombard, a monstrous cannon forged by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. It could fire stone projectiles weighing over half a ton. Each shot took hours to prepare and fired with a thunder that shook the ground. For weeks, the cannon roared against the walls of Theodosius, the same walls that had turned back invaders for nearly 1,000 years. Cracks appeared, towers crumbled, but still the city held. Inside Constantinople, life narrowed into a rhythm of waiting, repairing, praying. Streets were quiet, but not empty. Priests led processions through the avenues, icons were carried in solemn parades, and the faithful packed into the Hagia Sophia, whispering prayers that rose like smoke into the great dome. Children clung to their mothers. The old remembered past sieges, but even they could feel something different this time. This was not like before. This was final. The defenders manned the walls day and night, patching breaches, launching counterattacks, lighting fires to ward off night assaults. Constantine XI, emperor in title and soldier in practice, fought beside his men, sword in hand, moving from tower to tower, rallying courage. He wore no crown. He took no throne. He was the emperor of a dying world, and he carried that knowledge with quiet strength. Days became weeks. The bombardment continued. The Ottomans attempted to breach the harbor by sea, but the great chain across the Golden Horn held firm. Then, in an astonishing display of engineering and determination, Mehmed ordered his men to haul ships overland, across wooden tracks greased with oil and pulled by oxen and men alike. Overnight, the Ottoman fleet bypassed the chain, appearing suddenly inside the Golden Horn and catching the defenders off guard. The balance had shifted. The defenders were now pressed on every side. The walls continued to hold, but the weight of the siege grew unbearable. Supplies dwindled. Morale sagged. Every day, the sound of the cannon was louder, more relentless. Craters opened in the ground, smoke lingered in the sky, and then, on the night of May 28th, word spread that a final assault was coming at dawn. Emperor Constantine gathered his commanders. They embraced like brothers. Many wept. They knew what was to come. That night, in the Hagia Sophia, citizens gathered for one last liturgy. Greeks, Latins, clergy, soldiers, men and women, noble and poor, alike stood beneath the dome in silence, the centuries falling around them. The ancient chants echoed through the marble halls, hymns that had been sung for generations, tears mixed with incense. Forgiveness was asked. Old quarrels were put aside. The divisions of faith, so often a source of conflict, dissolved in the knowledge that something sacred was ending. And when the service ended, they walked out into the night, into the streets of their city, into the final hours of Byzantium. On the morning of May 29th, before the sun had fully risen, the Ottomans attacked. Waves of soldiers crashed against the walls, swarming through breaches, scaling ladders, battering gates. The defenders fought with desperate fury, but the outcome was never in doubt. One by one, the bastions fell. A small gate, known as the Kerkerporter, was left unguarded in the confusion, and through it, the invaders poured in. The city that had stood against centuries of enemies, that had survived fire, plague, betrayal, and siege, was finally breached. Emperor Constantine was last seen near the gate of St. Romanus, casting off his imperial regalia and charging into the fray. His body was never found. Some say he died in battle, others believe he was buried in secret, his name whispered as a martyr, as the final Basilius of Rome, a man who did not surrender, a city that did not fall until it was torn stone from stone. By midday, the Ottomans controlled the city. The streets were filled with the sounds of victory and sorrow. The Hagia Sophia, once the crown of Christendom, became a mosque. Its golden mosaics were covered, its silence filled with new prayers. The Byzantine Empire was gone. The Roman Empire, born over 1,000 years earlier along the banks of the Tiber, was no more. But though the city had fallen, it had not vanished. The stones still stood, the sea still shimmered, and within the soul of the new empire that rose, the Ottoman Empire, traces of Byzantium remained. The architecture, the law, the rituals, even the dreams. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the heart of a new world, but it never entirely forgot what it had been. And even now, long after the last emperor fell, long after the towers cracked and the domes echoed with new voices, the story of that final day remains, a moment suspended in time. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of a city, it was the end of an age. 1,000 years of memory, faith, and empire passed into history, and all that was left was silence. The kind that only comes after the last bell has rung, after the final cry has faded, after the sun has set on a dream that dared to last forever. Though the great empire had fallen, and Constantinople had changed hands, the city's heartbeat did not cease. It was a place where centuries layered one upon another, like the intricate mosaics that adorned its wall-siege piece, telling a story of faith, power, loss, and resilience. When the Ottomans entered the city, they did more than conquer a territory. They inherited a legacy forged in marble and prayer, in blood and fire, in the endless push and pull of civilizations. Constantinople, now Istanbul, was reborn, but never erased. The Hagia Sophia, once the grand cathedral of the Byzantine emperors, was transformed into a mosque. Its golden icons, covered but not destroyed, seemed to whisper from beneath the plaster, their faces veiled but unforgotten. Minarets rose beside its ancient dome, their slender spires reaching for the heavens just as the domes had before. The call to prayer echoed where once the Gregorian chants had filled the air. Yet beneath the new rhythms, the heartbeat of the old city remained steady, a slow and steady pulse that refused to be silenced. Istanbul became a bridge once again, not just between continents, but between eras, between cultures, between worlds. Its markets thrived with traders from the far corners of the globe, weaving together spices from India, silk from China, carpets from Persia, and jewels from the Mediterranean. The streets hummed with a vibrant tapestry of languages and lives. Mosques and churches, palaces and bazaars, Ottoman sultans, and Greek merchants each contributed to a living mosaic that was as complex as it was beautiful. Though the empire had changed, the spirit of Byzantium lingered in unexpected ways. The Ottoman rulers, fascinated by the grandeur of what they had inherited, preserved many of the city's structures. They adopted elements of Byzantine art and architecture, blending them with their own to create a unique fusion that would define Istanbul's skyline for centuries to come. Scholars translated ancient texts preserved in Byzantine libraries. Artists studied mosaics and icons. Even the legal codes of the Ottomans bore the imprint of Roman law, a testament to the enduring influence of the empire that had once ruled from these shores. But beyond the stone and mortar, beyond the politics and conquests, there was something more profound, something intangible that made the city special. It was the memory. The stories whispered in quiet moments by the Bosphorus, the legends told by grandmothers to their grandchildren under star-filled skies, the prayers offered in churches, mosques, and synagogues alike, all beneath the same vast sky, the knowledge that beneath every layer of the city lay a history that refused to be forgotten. Even today, if you wander through Istanbul's narrow streets, you can feel it, the past brushing against your skin like a breeze, the echo of footsteps from long ago, mingling with the hum of modern life. The way the light falls on ancient stones, catching the colors of the sea and sky. The murmur of the city is a song of resilience, a lullaby of endurance. It tells of empires that rose and fell, of dreams that burned bright and then faded, and of a city that kept breathing through it all. Constantinople's story is not one of endings, but of transformation. It reminds us that even when empires crumble, when kingdoms fall and borders shift, the soul of a place can live on. It lingers in the stones, in the stories, in the very air we breathe. It waits patiently, like a quiet flame flickering in the dark, ready to ignite the imagination and carry us through the night. So as you drift into sleep tonight, imagine yourself walking through this timeless city. Hear the gentle lap of the Bosphorus against ancient walls. Feel the cool stone beneath your fingertips. See the golden light of a setting sun reflecting off domes and minarets. And know that you are part of a story much larger than any one of USA's story of endurance, of hope, and of the endless dance between past and present. The city waits for you, timeless and tender, a sleepy century all its own. Good night.